Welcome to Reason for Truth. I'm your host, Stephen Garofalo. Today we're going to talk about the importance of the oath, or an oath, part one. We're going to do this in two parts. Welcome to another episode of Reason for Truth. In this episode and then the next, which is part two of the importance of the oath, we're going to be going back and looking at two couples. We're going to start with that. We're interviewed an ABC News article titled, "Four Couples Married More Than 50 Years. Spill the Secrets of Long-Lasting Love." That was by Joy Marie McKenzie, February 6, 2017. We're going to look at here the blessings and the seriousness of keeping an oath and keeping our word, keeping our promises. And I want to use these long-lasting couples because they took the oath of marriage. And that's what we want to talk about today, amongst just speaking about what an oath is and the importance of keeping it. Listen, when asked about the secret of their 75 years of marriage, Sammy and Macy Waller of Lancaster, New York, married 75 years now. Macy said that there was one thing I wish I knew, it would be to understand the sincerity of marriage. It's important to remember the vows you said when you got married and go back to them. This is the person that you said, that gives your word, you loved. Macy's saying that their bonds were an oath that they would love each other unto death do us part, till they pass from this life into the next. Listen, they made their oaths to one another and before God and before other people. You know, Macy went on to say this: "I didn't realize it as much when I got married, but through the years, that is, your wedding vows or an oath, can help you carry through." When asked what advice Macy would give to younger people who would like to get married or are newly married, Macy's advice was this: think about the vows that they've made and don't get angry or upset about something and say, listen, I don't want to be in this because that's not what you promised. And always give respect to each other. I like what Macy said, what you promised. That generation is a little older. They understood that keeping the word was a biblical, really based in biblical truth, right? Macy's on the same page as the Word of God regarding the importance of keeping an oath. John says in 1 John 2:5, "But whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. By this we may know that we are in him." And that's what we want to talk about today, the love of God shown through your oath. Listen, welcome to Reason for Truth, where the truth comes first and the reasons come last, but where we're always and constantly learning. Because listen, when we stop learning, we stop teaching, or at least stop teaching well. Today's truth is that we are called to live by, to carry out, and to stick with any oath or word that we make, even when we don't want to, even when it's hard, and maybe perhaps when it costs us something. Furthermore, to break or willfully fail to carry through with our word or an oath is a violation of the agreement we made with one another before God, or made before you and another person, or between you and God. That's serious stuff, but an oath kept, in contrast, fosters deep trust, love, selflessness, and joy. Today I'm going to show you the seriousness of keeping your word as an oath made between you and others, and what God's word says about the importance of keeping an oath in our world. Listen, it's important for us to remember that God is infinite, He's omnipresent, and He's omniscient. So listen, whatever we say, whatever we think, including giving our word, making a promise, and taking a formal oath, we do so with God as our witness. And in this episode, we're going to look at the seriousness and the consequences of failing to keep an oath. In our follow-up episode, part 2, we're going to look at the blessings God promises us when we do keep our word and our promises and maintain the oaths we make and give the words that we give, right? Let's start by looking at what an oath is. That's a good place to start. There's not a lot of difference between, listen, you have my word and I promise, or something like, you have my word. You know, it's all pretty much the same thing. It could all be taken really in the present tense, I guess. But essentially, this means the same thing as I promise. According to www.lexico.com, regarding synonyms of oath by Oxford Dictionary, a vow sworn, it's a promise, it's a pledge, it's a vow, it's an affirmation, it's a word of honor, it's just giving your word, and it's a bond. It's a bond of guarantee. And listen, there are simply different words meaning the same thing, which is to include an oath. In other words, an oath is simply a structured form of giving your word or making and keeping a promise. Listen, I don't see much difference in God's eyes between them. Between human beings, oaths can be legally binding when applied to swearing on the Bible, making formal commitments before the government, corporate, or perhaps civil officials. Listen, in its traditional noun form, the word oath, an oath is an allegiance to the king in a traditional past way. That's the way we think of it quite often. It's a vow. It's a sworn statement, promise, pledge, word. It's a bond. It's a guarantee. We see that with, listen, King Herod, when John went before, John the Baptist went before him, and, he made a promise before everybody. He didn't really want to take John the Baptist's head, but the daughter of his wife said, hey, time to take John the Baptist's head off. He really couldn't revoke that because he gave his word. Even though he made his promise, it was a solid oath. He was the king. An oath is, especially with the king, it's a vow, it's a sworn statement, a promise, a pledge, a word, a bond, or a guarantee to do something which was and still is legally binding. This leads us to look specifically at what an oath is, because the word oath appears in the Old Testament and the New Testament of the Bible. Let's look in the New Testament. Luke 1, verses 71 to 73 says this, that we should be saved from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us, to show the mercy promised to our fathers and to remember his holy covenant, the oath that he swore to our father Abraham, to grant us that we, being delivered from the hand of our enemies, might serve him without fear. See, the oath here, ladies and gentlemen, is speaking to the covenant that God made with Abraham, recorded in Genesis 22, verses 16 to 18. Luke here, by the way, is using the Greek word horkon, H-O-R-K-O-N, which means oath. See, God's oath indicates how committed God is to his promise. The only other oath mentioned in Luke through the book of Acts is the one God made to David as of the heir of the throne in Acts 2:30. We also see oaths being taken in 2 Samuel, chapter 7, verses 8 to 16, and Psalms 132, verse 11, which these are called in Greek horkos, H-O-R-K-O-S. In Hebrew, an oath really meant to bind oneself, to include making a promise. See, taking an oath in the Old Testament was to make a solemn appeal to God in attestation to the truth of a statement or the binding character of the promise. This is important, ladies and gentlemen, because American culture, I can say specifically, in years past was based on your word. A lot of people didn't have to use contracts. I still work with people. We don't need a contract. Why? We have years of experience where we just respect each other. All that being said, it's evident that God takes keeping your word or an oath with the utmost seriousness. An oath is a solemn promise, often invoking divine witness. Interesting, regarding one's future action or behavior. It's what the marriage covenant is based on. While a contract can be broken, see that a legal contract, an oath or covenant cannot. See, once broken, a covenant made with an oath must be dissolved, and the agreement must, if possible, you have to really start over. I was with Dr. Norman Geisler years ago talking to a friend who had been through divorce, and he said you cannot, in a sense, technically, when you've had infidelity in a marriage, you have broken the oath. Now, you can work things out, but you cannot really, the marriage covenant cannot be repaired. It has to be severed and then restarted as a brand new oath, because that's the way it is. It's not something that can be repaired. You either broke it or you keep it, right? Interesting concept. I don't hear that much talked about, but that's what he said, and I thought there's a lot of truth to that. But, all right, so it must be dissolved in agreement, and if possible, to start over by taking a new oath with a new covenant. And in reality, you make oaths on a regular basis in friendships, and family relationships, community relationships, and business relationships. And by the way, I would say this, that I think that if you've had infidelity, the best thing to do is to restart and just get remarried. I'm not saying you have to divorce, by the way. That would have been a good question for Dr. Geisler, because that's more of a legal contract, is to go back and renew your vows or start over, and not renew, but actually start with new vows and a new covenant. Anyways, tough subject, I know. All this illustrates, the importance of making and taking and keeping your word as the form of the oath. There are two important things that we need to understand about an oath. First, making a vow or taking an oath and giving our word are all forms of an oath. Dictionary.com defines an oath and a vow, VOW, as a solemn promise or a pledge or a personal commitment. So how many of us have made a vow in those forms to God in a time of trouble, and then failed to follow through with it? We say things like, God, man, if you just get me out of this, I'm going to do X, I'm going to go to church, I'm going to do this. How many of us casually throw out the words, I swear, hear that all the time on the television. Really? This is, I swear on this or I swear on that. You see, listen, it's essential to keep our oath and to keep our word. And when we say we will do something, we should carry through with it. You see, when you make a vow, it's wise, or an oath, it's wise to remember that it's a matter between you and God, ultimately. Even though it's maybe between you and a person, it's ultimately, keeping it ultimately goes to the high court of God. God honors all of his vows. We see some of them in the New Testament, in the Old Testament. And sometimes keeping, vows or oaths can really have consequences if we fail to do so. It's important for us. God always keeps his word. He always keeps his oath. He's perfect. And he's all good. That never happens. You never have to worry about God keeping or not keeping his words. Listen, he always keeps his word. 100% of the time, forever, in infinitude. That's God. That's awesome. Now listen, second, making a vow or taking an oath and giving our words. Remember, they're all forms of the same informal or formal oath. See, Jesse Dean, I was reading online, he calls himself Jesse Dean Roughneck at oil and gas industry. He wrote this in 1997, or I guess it's when he started that online profile, and he was on Quora.com, and he wrote this. He said, I believe it is a golden rule. If a man can't be trusted to do what he says he can do or will do, then he isn't worth much to me. Listen, that's pretty rough words. Some would argue that an oath is something different than saying you will do something in promise or in word. It was interesting. His words were, it was a golden rule. There is only the golden rule, by the way. That's the second greatest. That's the greatest commandment, all right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, strength, and soul. Second is like it, right? Love your neighbor as yourself, right? Treat others as you want to be treated. That's what he's saying without the biblical authority behind that. It's just a good thing that we should be doing, right? With the God behind it, it's an absolute thing that holds consequences. We need to be doing, we must be doing. Now, here on the other hand, Jesus tells us quite differently in Matthew 5:37 when he said, let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than that comes from evil. This is fascinating. See, Jesus said that oath should really not be given in the first place. And he said this, Jesus said, do not swear at all, period. And what he's saying, just let your yes be yes and your no be no. See, here's the deal. We wouldn't need contracts and we wouldn't need oaths if everyone just spoke the truth. If your yes was yes, your no was no. As Christians now, we have that, we're under the special revelation and we are directly accountable to God. For those who don't believe in Jesus Christ, don't believe in the Bible, it's not that they're not going to be accountable to God, but they're not under that special revelation. So I'm not grouping the whole world here, by the way. I'm saying specifically Christians, we have the high mark, which I think is the standard mark, to say, listen, if I say this, I mean it. If I don't, then I don't, right? I mean, if my yes is yes, my no is, can you do this? Yes or no? Had a man ask me to take his son. They were in a group of where our children and our sons and are in a group, and we're going on a trip. And he said, "Well, I can't make the trip. Could you?" He was hinting, I need someone to take my son. Happy to take his son, but I just want to make sure that I can keep my word before I agree to it. Instead of saying yes and then have to say, man, I can't do that. I had to check with my son and check with our schedule and a bunch of other things. But I told him later, yeah, I think we can do it. Let me just double check it. He ended up having someone else take the ride, which is fine. I think that's great. So, listen, we're not to swear at all. We're not to give or take an oath or give our word if it's hasty. If we can't make it or we don't know if we can make it, just hold tight. Make sure if you're going to give your yes that you really mean yes and you're willing to carry through. Now, at the end of the day, when Jesus is saying, he said the words, do not swear at all. Listen, Jesus knew that the reason for oaths being used in the first place, as I said earlier, was to emphasize the wickedness of man's heart. Okay? In other words, I know you said yes, but now I'm going to hold you to it. It's official. You're going to go to court or you're going to face the governmental punishment for that. Now, Jesus is making the point in this passage that one's life should be sufficient to back up one's words. A yes always ought to mean yes, and a no should always or ought to always mean no. Jesus was clear what he said again. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. See, the oath. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is the footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. Matthew 5:33 to 37. I wanted to give you that whole passage there. It's interesting what Jesus is saying. Now he's explaining why you make your yes, yes, and your no, no. Okay, first let's notice, looking at this passage, what comes right before this passage in verse 32, speaking of the law of adultery. Going back to that, Jesus speaks very, very strong language about the sin of adultery and why it's so dangerous. The Proverbs are filled with the adulteress and the temptations and wisdom. God's wisdom keeps you from the adulteress. Because, listen, dealing with adultery, this defies, and if you break the wedding oath, the marriage oath, it breaks one of the most intimate oaths taken before God, which is the marriage covenant, which is made with an oath. See, it's the very next verse, verse 33, that Jesus speaks to us about the danger of making an oath should you not plan to carry out with it, that oath with fidelity in marriage or in business or otherwise, and unto death. See, in verses 33 to 37, by the way, Jesus warns about swearing falsely. Did you notice that? And which is to perjure yourself. We've seen politicians and business people and just everyday people who perjure themselves. What does that mean? They go to court, they swear on the Bible, right, as that made that oath, and then what happens is they were caught lying. That's called perjury. Oaths taken in the name of the Lord were binding back, especially in the Old Testament with the king. The perjury was strongly condemned in the Old Testament law. Man, you can get killed for that. Exodus 27, verse 7, Leviticus chapter 9, verse 12, and Deuteronomy 9, verses 16 and 19. You can read more about that there. Every oath contained an affirmation or promise and an appeal to God as the omniscient punisher of falsehoods, which made the oath binding. Thus we find phrases in the Bible such as the Lord lives in 1 Samuel 14:39. The emphasis on the sanctity of the oaths led to the feeling that ordinary phrases need not be truthful or binding. Jesus, however, taught, as he said in verse 37, that we should say and mean yes or no and never equivocate, meaning use ambiguous language so as to conceal the truth or avoid committing oneself to sin, being evasive, being non-committal, purposely to deceive others and make the truth unclear, to subvert the oath taken. You'll see that with people when they kind of use words real slowly and carefully and they don't say anything. You'd see that in the press all the time, or, hey, listen, did you ask questions? And the person that's in charge of that has just been skilled in not answering the question directly, but giving just enough to say we did a press release thing or whatever. Remember, God is omniscient. He's eternal. He's just and he's perfect. And as such, he cannot overlook a broken oath. He cannot overlook deceit or subversion of the truth, and eventually he acts to bring correction. So to bring marriage covenant, to lie in court under an oath, or to swear by the name of God, all these things, we're going to be directly accountable to God, and God will call us all into accountability for the oaths kept and the oaths that we've broken. In closing, let's remember Sammy and Macy Waller, who so far have kept their oath of marriage, 75 years. I want to recall Macy's words again because they're resolute. They're based on the resolute word of God, the Bible. Okay, these two who've been married 75 years, they take their oath very serious. Their oath between one another, and obviously by their words, their oath to God and others, to be eternal. Remember Macy's words as she says, it's important to remember the vows you said when you got married and go back to them. This is the person you said you loved. I didn't realize that as much when I got married, but through the years that I can help carry you through, let's remember as well Macy's advice to younger couples, which is think about the vows that they've made and don't get angry or upset about something and say, I don't want to be in this, right? Talking about marriage, because that's not what you, promised. And the oath is a form of the promise. And always give respect to each other, she ends that with. And that's important. have to make sure we respect each other, despite if they're to the other side of the aisle, no matter who they are. Treating the respect even to our enemies is important. Listen, today's truth is that we are called to live by, carry out, and stick with any promise, any word, any given oath taken that we've given when we don't want to, and even when it costs us something. And to break and willfully fail to do so is a violation of the agreement we make, or that we made, not only with one another, but also before God, divine God of the universe himself. But an oath kept fosters deep trust, love, selflessness, and joy. Now, for the positive side of keeping your word and an oath, and we're going to go back to John 2:5, says this, "But whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. By this we may know that we are in him." This is the truth of the oath that Sammy and Macy Waller made 75 years ago. And in our next episode, we're going to look at blessings of God gives forever, whoever keeps his word. Please make sure that you subscribe to Reason for Truth and hit that boom, that little alert bell down there. You don't miss any of those. You don't want to do that. And listen, before you go, please leave your comments below. I promised I will respond to you within a reasonable amount of time. You don't want to miss part 2. We're going to pick up with two more people, and we're going to look at what they said about being married 63, or I guess at this point probably 65 years, since the article's a few years old. And if you're listening on one of our podcast platforms, please consider, and especially in iTunes, to give us a 5-star review. That'd be appreciated. Share this with others. And if you're on YouTube, again, as I just said, make sure you do a couple things, man. After you tell all your friends about us, make sure you do one thing. Number one, what is that? Subscribe. A little easy. Just click the button. And then listen, second time, smash that little alert bell down there. As my German friend says, press the clock. I like it. Just it's a little bit different. Sicilians really knock that thing out. Germans are all methodical. Love it. Both are wonderful. Appreciate you tuning in with today. God's blessings to you. Make sure let's keep our word. I'm your host, Stephen Garofalo, and this is your Reason for Truth for today.